Journey of the Magi by T.S. Eliot. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey, the ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter, and the camels galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. Then the camel men cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile and the towns unfriendly and the villages dirty and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. At the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. Then at dawn we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and water mill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky, and an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Then we came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel, 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver, and feet kicking the empty wineskins. But there was no information, so we continued and arrived at evening, not a moment too soon, finding the place. It was, you may say, satisfactory. All this was a long time ago, I remember, and I would do it again, but set down this, where we led all that way for birth or death. There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. T.S. Eliot published the poem Journey of the Magi in 1927. It's a remarkable Christmas poem for a number of reasons. As we journey into the season of Christmas, we see so many of the Christmas poetry and Christmas songs of this year celebrating the joyous festivities in this joyous season, and all of that is correct. But T.S. Eliot in his poem looks at a whole different angle of Christmas, because we must not forget that the birth that Christmas celebrates was also the death of the old world. What must those people have felt like who were witnessing such a climactic change happening in their world? What feelings and thoughts must they have had knowing that nothing could ever be the same? It's important to see some of T.S. Eliot's own convictions around this time. He was born in 1888 to a rather stiff Unitarian family, a faith that he held until his conversion to Anglo-Catholicism in 1925. By this time, T.S. Eliot had already made a pretty big name for himself, writing such memorable poems as Proof Rock in 1917, and more notably, The Wasteland in 1922. In 1925, he also published The Hollow Men, which takes as form a dramatic monologue, a form that T.S. Eliot excels in a number of poems. We might think of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. We might think of his 1920 poem, Duranition. We might also think of parts of The Wasteland, which are narrated by a medley of voices. He returns to that form in this 1927 poem, Journey of the Magi, a poem in which he is really starting to explore the beginnings of his newfound Anglo-Catholic faith. Let's go ahead and take a dive, first of all, into T.S. Eliot's style. There's so much that we can say about this style because it's so distinctive, and it's a little bit off-putting because it seems so simple the first time we look at it. In fact, when we're reading it, there doesn't even seem to be a lot of overt poetical language, but that's exactly part of T.S. Eliot's genius. He is able to couch and conceal the poeticisms of his speech, and he's able to control his rhythm in such a way with such vigor that you think there must be no rhythm at all. Let's go ahead and take a look at this first stanza to see how Eliot's style works. In the beginning, we have the speaker introduced with the parentheses, who is speaking the first 5-6 lines. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey, the ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. You can even hear the rhythm already in that speech. This actually then will go to another speaker, and the camels galled, sore-footed, refractory. lying down in the melting snow. So we have two voices here already. Another way that we can see here, especially in those first 5-6 lines, is Eliot's way of doubling certain lines. What I mean by that is that Eliot will often put two words together and do this pattern throughout so that you have certain resonances of the line. For example, we have cold coming. Now that line is obviously alliterative, but it definitely helps us to emphasize the doubling aspect. Worst time is another one. Long journey, ways deep, weather sharp, very dead. So you can see right here, Eliot has this habit of doing these doublings. There are other ways in which Eliot is able to show us his rhythm. This line, for example, lying down in the melting snow, lying down in the melting snow, we can definitely hear this sort of rocking rhythm that he establishes. And it's not something he does terribly consistently throughout the poem, but he does do it enough that we can definitely tell he is doing this on purpose. What's the point of doing this, though? Well, part of Eliot's style is to give us this rhythm but make it seem as though it is colloquial language. It's a way of heightening just everyday speech with an extra poetic emphasis. Another place where we can see this rhythm is in his paratactic use of the conjunction and, which we see in the second half of stanza 1. This is when the Magi are listing their many qualms and the many difficulties they have faced on the road. Just listen to the list that Eliot provides for us. Then the camel men cursing and grumbling, and running away, and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out, and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty, and charging high prices. So again, even though we don't exactly have a strict metrical rhythm, Eliot is nevertheless able to provide rhythm in different places. Something else we might notice about this poem and the way it is constructed is in Eliot's use of juxtaposition. He is constantly contrasting images here and there. For example, we have the contrast overall of the Eastern Magi who are journeying into the West. So we have this contrast of East and West. The whole poem is also the contrast about the new birth breaking into the old world, so old and new. This also implies the contrast of birth and death. So with the birth of the new world, we have the death of the old. But we even see those contrasts throughout the poem and other places as well. We have the fact that the Magi are doing this journey in the middle of winter, and yet when they come into Judea, when they come into Bethlehem, we immediately learn that they are going to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line and smelling of vegetation. These are images that we might associate with springtime, with summertime, not necessarily with the dead of winter. We also have the idea of inside versus outside, of town and city, as when the Magi are complaining. And then again, we have the inside and outside, when we come to the tavern door and we must go, as we know from the Christmas story, into the stable where Christ is born. Another Eliot stylistic is his ability to choose the exact correct words. He chooses such adjectives and such descriptions that after we read them, we think there's no other more precise way you could have described that. Listening to how he describes the camels as galled, sore-footed, refractory, they are such precise words, and even refractory is rather a difficult word. We have to pause and think about it for a moment, which adds a little bit of difficulty to our understanding of the poem, something that Eliot perhaps intends, because this is, after all, a difficult journey. Another example of this is when we come to the tavern, and Eliot gives us just 3 details to describe it. He says, first of all, that there are vine leaves over the lintel, that there are 6 hands dicing for silver, and that there are feet kicking the empty wineskins. These, at first glance, appear to be quite random details, and yet Eliot has chosen them for very specific reasons. We are glancing at the scene as it would be from angles and not from a front head-on position. What I mean by that is we would expect that we might have the wise men going through the door and looking at perhaps the countertop where the bartender is, or perhaps the tables where the people are at, but we are looking up, we're looking away from the immediate details, up towards the lintel where we have the vine leaves. When we have the 6 hands at an open table, we don't actually have the whole scene there in front of us. We are, as it were, looking at it from an angle, not really getting all the details in. So too with the feet kicking the empty wineskins. Again, we're looking at feet and hands and above. We don't have the full scene in front of us. And that's appropriate because the Magi have not come for this. They have come for the miracle in Bethlehem. All of this, as it were, is simply beside the point. It's not the main focus. And so Eliot gives us what's above the lintel, some hands and some feet. Ultimately, in these details, what Eliot is good about doing is giving us a bunch of images and showing them all next to each other in this rather jagged style, as we would expect from maybe a long journey where things start to blend into one another. There's a really distinctive style that Eliot assumes when he writes in the voice of his dramatic monologues. He takes the voice of figures who are on the margin, as it were, of the world. In Geronician, we have the voice of an old man who's facing his mortality. We have the voice of J. Alfred Prufrock, who is looking at his life from the standpoint that all was frivolous and of no account. This idea of looking at the world on its margins, or looking at a world in this point of transition, is something that Eliot also shares with his contemporary William Butler Yeats. It was Yeats who wrote in his Sailing to Byzantium, "That is no country for old men." Yeats's voice there is of an old man who realizes he can no longer live in the world he once thought he knew. So too do we have Eliot here taking on a similar voice of wise men, of magi who come from an old world and realize by the end of their journey that their old world cannot continue on any longer. So what is this poem ultimately about? Well, when we come to the third stanza, we begin to understand what has been going on. This monologue has been told to us by one of the three wise men at the very end of his life. He even says at the beginning, "All this was a long time ago. I remember, and I would do it again." So he is recounting what happened here, and we might even assume he has been trying his whole life to understand exactly what has happened. And what has happened is nothing less than one of the great paradoxes of Christmas, that as we look into the deadest part of the year, where the world appears to shut down, what we are given is a birth, and the birth of a vulnerable child, which is to be the savior of the world. At the same time, the paradox lies in the fact that this child is ultimately offered up for death for the same world. So in the birth, we have a death. And that is no less true of the child than it is of the world. As the child comes into the world, so too must the old world die. And that is exactly what the wise man says at the end. We are no longer at ease here in the old dispensation with an alien people clutching their gods. We might notice just how much this contrasts with the opening stanza, where the wise magi is talking about how much he misses the sherbet girls and how much he misses the palaces back home. No longer does he feel at home there. No longer does he feel like the old ways serve him. But the ultimate whammy has to come in the last line. "I should be glad of another death." There's a reason that we call these people wise men, and perhaps it's because they were noted astrologers and astronomers and were able to read the signs of heaven. Or perhaps it's also because they knew when the old ways would no longer satisfy. It is a death, yes, it is a death of everything that cannot fit into God's new kingdom, but this is a death that ultimately brings life. And no matter how painful this death is to experience, and we know that no matter how black death seems, there is a life that exists beyond it. And that is one of the messages of Christmas.